Disney ruined Star Wars. Not through Daisy Ridley's Rey, despite a clear lack of direction or understanding of what that character should be, not through unnecessary spin-off films that nobody asked for, and certainly not some abstract idea of wokeness that, despite literally years of online discourse, I still don't think I ever heard a single reasonable argument as to what that's really supposed to mean.
Alpha's not going to send an army because she doesn't have to. She'll send Beta.
This Beta, he their best? Good. Kill him first.
Instead, Disney broke Star Wars in order to build it back on its own terms.
But this does put a smile on my face.
The reason I bring this up is that looking back in retrospect of the last trilogy in the Star Wars saga, it is kind of crazy to sit there and understand that Disney didn't have that much of an idea of what they were doing with this particular story. Even if we could divorce ourselves from the toxic back and forth that's plagued the Star Wars community for the last several years, as well as take away your subjective opinion about each individual film or the trilogy as a whole, I think it would be very hard to look at what Disney ultimately gave us and think to yourself, that was a really tight story. I mean, just literally looking at the context of the reintroduction of Palpatine in episode 9, despite him not appearing or even being mentioned throughout the first two films in the trilogy, the mysterious introduction of Snoke in episode 7 and then his quick dispatching in episode 8, or the idea that Luke Skywalker went into seclusion with absolutely no plans for anyone to find him despite leaving a map. Now, all in all, even just by talking about this, I want to make it clear that I am in no way saying that I hate the trilogy or that I'm even remotely related to the part of the fan base that's made it very clear that the introduction of Disney's trilogy destroyed their childhood. If you ask me, that's just not true, and anybody who's going to tell you that is being overdramatic. What I am suggesting here is that no matter how competently these films were made, how much money they shoveled into them, or whoever they got in front of or even behind the camera, at the end of the day, Disney did not want to make these movies, or to put it more simply, Disney wanted Star Wars to be theirs and not yours. Now, before we do go any further, I just want to say that this is my opinion. Obviously, I have no idea what's going on behind the scenes with Star Wars, Disney, or anything remotely related to this mega franchise. In fact, in case you don't already know, I would stop listening completely to anyone who tells you otherwise. The cold hard reality of the situation is that when it comes to the business of filmmaking, almost everything in terms of creative decisions or financial incentives is shrouded in so much mystery that even the people who do it on a daily basis couldn't even explain to you the reality of their day-to-day lives. But with that being said, this is the internet, we are fans, and this is stuff that we can always speculate and have a general conversation about. So try to put all of that into context when I tell you that Disney doesn't really care about the cultural backlash of their mishandling of the sequel trilogy. Because at the end of the day, it's more important to restructure the brand in their own image, one that continues in perpetuity instead of something that was married to the story of a singular family narrative from the original 6 films.
Shut up!
Now, don't get me wrong here. Obviously, after Disney acquired Lucasfilm for $4 billion in 2012, their initial idea was to continue the Skywalker saga. It's just that despite the financial prospects that became a reality in 2015 with the release of The Force Awakens, and that ultimately continued despite what trolls online like to say with Rogue One, The Last Jedi, Solo, and even Rise of the Skywalker, it seems pretty hard to escape the fact that after Episode 6, Return of the Jedi, and the 3 prequel films made by George Lucas, that by the time Disney acquired Star Wars, the story was pretty much done. I mean, really think about this. No matter how many people were clamoring for a sequel trilogy to the original 3 films, by the time Disney acquired Star Wars, we already had Luke Skywalker bringing his father Anakin back to the light side, Anakin restoring balance to the Force, and an entire trilogy of stories that no one really asked for. In terms of what Star Wars is and always was on the cinematic landscape, at that point we had already seen everything that we needed to know and even a little bit more. But the reality reality of the situation was that there was money to be made, and in order to do that, they had to reopen the story, and the best way to do that would be a nostalgic sequel trilogy. And even looking at it that way, it's not overly surprising that episode 7 was so much more of a nostalgia grab than most fans wanted it to be. Just quite frankly, they had no other option at the time. In retrospect, all the movie really even needed to do was reintroduce fans to the old guard of characters from the original trilogy, and it didn't even really do that right. I would argue because they had already locked themselves into a legit trilogy in order to end the saga. And in that way, there was absolutely no time for them to take an entire movie, or maybe even more, focusing on the old characters and learning what they had been up to and how much they've changed in the last 30 years. Certainly not when you're trying to introduce a new batch of characters, both good and evil, and setting up a storyline that's pretty much going to mirror everything that came before. And that's really the crux of this entire problem. Disney is so consumed with what they want to do with the entire universe worth of content in Star Wars that they didn't give enough proper attention to the story that they had to tell in 3 films. The vast majority of which felt like a sales pitch for the next decade worth of Star Wars content that narratively sought to undermine and sweep over the main cast of characters and introduce their own new characters to the mythology. Many of those characters now seem primed for their own spin-off trilogy, or maybe even a television series on Disney Plus sometime in the future.
You ain't gonna Disney Plus me. I ain't getting no Disney Plus.
And even though those original plans might have fallen through, Disney has seemingly pivoted in a new direction on Disney Plus that they are now promising will pay off in a massive way going forward.
Give me the ball. Grogu. Give me the ball.
This brings us all the way back to the latest news that Disney is working on a new trilogy of Star Wars films. Well, a trilogy might be a little disingenuous, as the House of Mouse is currently working on 3 separate Star Wars movies, each of which can either be the start of their own franchise, or more realistically, are each new spin-offs being developed to gauge where exactly audiences' interests lie going forward. First, it appears that Disney is gearing up for the return of Rey Skywalker?
Rey Skywalker.
In a film set 15 years after the events of The Rise of Skywalker, where we focus on the rebuilding of a new Jedi Order. It's a film that I'm hoping will eventually see the light of day, but given Lucasfilm's new habit of throwing away entire pitches and directors like they're nothing, we're gonna have to wait and see. Still, I feel like the idea of bringing Daisy Ridley back into the fold is enough to make sure that this film actually happens. Because if nothing else, Episode 9 was seemingly built on the idea that characters like Rey would continue onward in their own stories in the immediate future. Additionally, I can't help but feel like this entire film might just be a bridge between the sequel trilogy and a potential episode 10, 11, and 12 sometime in the future. Next, it looks like we're getting Disney's new poster boy, James Mangold's introduction into the Star Wars universe, with a film that's focused on the first Jedi wielding the Force. The film will allegedly take inspiration from films like Ben-Hur and the 10 Commandments, which somewhat makes sense on a whole prequel origin of the Jedi religion aspect of the narrative, but given James Mangold's history, I would still really like to see some Western-style approach to this one, if just a little bit. Finally, it appears that Dave Filoni is making a film about the escalating war between the Imperial remnants and the New Republic, in what is being touted as a cinematic event in the Mando timeline. And I have a lot of thoughts on this one. To keep it just a little bit brief, this is probably the event that Lucasfilm has been working towards for the last several years now. And without a doubt, it is something that a lot of people are going to get excited for, even if the initial ratings of The Mandalorian Season 3 have been less than stellar. The Star Wars brand is still strong enough to bring in droves of fans for a cinematic offering, regardless of some fan reactions.
How can fandom be toxic?
Still, I can't help but feel like this Mandalorian cinematic event is just another example of Disney somewhat losing the thread in kind of the same way that has affected the MCU as of late. You see, at its heart, I think the Star Wars franchise is an easily digestible series of one-off adventures that don't require an intimate understanding of the extended lore to truly appreciate the immediate spectacle of it all. However, Dave Filoni's film seems to be challenging that idea altogether, as it's currently being sold as the resolution to a conflict being explored primarily in The Mandalorian, The Book of Boba Fett, and other Disney Plus exclusive shows, all of which can only be accessed through a paid monthly subscription service. Yeah, oh well. Maybe it's fine. It's not like Disney Plus shows have ever hurt the quality of a cinematic event in the past.
Lying. Not so much.
I mean, surely by now Disney understands that creating homework for a general audience results in a less ravenous fan base for your content. Oh, yeah. Yeah. So with all jokes and sarcastic tones aside, I wanted to take today to focus on one of the biggest problems that I have with the current direction Disney has taken its exclusive streaming content, especially when it comes to specific brands like the aforementioned MCU shows, The Mandalorian, The Book of Boba Fett, and a litany of upcoming projects that are sure to help Disney surpass Netflix as the premier subscription service in the entire world. Unfortunately, at the time of recording this video, all of those projects, despite their interconnection with their respective universes, are only available on Disney+. In fact, when asked if any of the MCU shows would ever make their way to home video, Marvel's head Kevin Feige responded, "Is The Mandalorian on Blu-ray? You could pay a very low fee per month and have access to something that you could put on your TV whenever you want." And I just have to take one quick second here and say, seriously? Am I the only person who has a problem with all of these answers? It's one thing to delay any potential home release for marquee brands such as this, but it's something else entirely to deny us the option altogether. Let's just be clear, when it comes to the MCU and Star Wars, these projects are increasingly non-skippable, with important characters, locations, and plot events being woven into every individual series, movie, or other type of interconnected project. So it does seem like each new series requires some borderline knowledge of the last to understand exactly what's going on. And this is becoming particularly true when it comes to the Marvel Cinematic Universe, that has somewhat undeniably lost its main narrative thread after the conclusion of Phase 3 and the Infinity Stone saga. Gone are the days of vaguely introducing different colored shiny rocks in a handful of loosely connected movies.
Infinity Stones?
Oh, we actually got a lot of those. Yeah, some of the guys use them as paperweights.
Still, the issue remains. No matter what the overall thread of these stories are, they are more reliant than ever on each other in order to make sense. And when you start to factor in that the only legitimate way that you can watch over half of the content that was released this year from Marvel is through a monthly subscription service, you can start to see the predatory nature of the entire industry rearing its ugly head. These days, it just feels like you can't own anything anymore, not even your favorite media. Even if the people behind those projects want you to revisit those series over and over and over again, and they have the power to help that be an easier burden than a monthly subscription service that you're paying way more for than what it actually is worth. Because if we're clear, at the end of the day, it's more profitable for you, me, and everyone else to rent it for a monthly fee. And all of this is on top of other shady business practices that we've seen ever since Disney Plus's inception. Look, my only problem with this, as well as pretty much everything related to the MCU these days, is that if you want to see this film, you'd better subscribe to Disney Plus in order to catch up on the multiple seasons worth of television just to understand what is going on. So when you start factoring in the absurd amount of content being pushed upon audiences by Disney and marrying that with the knowledge that the only way to legally access that content is through some monthly subscription service, you start to see what exactly is going on and the biggest problem with this expansion of these cinematic universes. It's the predatory nature of this industry that is starting to rear its ugly head to once again reiterate the fact that neither you nor I can own our media anymore. That instead, we the consumers will be forced to rent our favorite content for eternity, just in case we might want to watch those movies, TV shows, or short presentations sometime in the undefined future. Look, I'm not really making this video to hyper-focus on Disney's shady business practices or some kind of depressing reality of modern-day franchises. I'm excited for these new Star Wars films because they're Star Wars films. I grew up with this series, and even though it's not my favorite of all time, it certainly still holds a lot of sway in my personal nostalgia. The Mandalorian is one of the best shows on television, and I'm certainly happy to see the return of Rey Skywalker more than most people.
Rey Skywalker.
Even an announcement in a historic film in the Star Wars universe seems like an easy enough idea that it should have happened well over a decade ago. I just think that nothing about this announcement is relatively groundbreaking. As exciting or even headache-inducing as you think these announcements are, it's important to remember that they're just still the product of the world's largest multimedia company, each of them being a separate bite at the apple in order to see where exactly the mega franchise can go in the future based off of audiences' reception to each individual product. But that's just my take.
The KRW Network.